So this is the second in this series of talks, which is dedicated to 19th century women philosophers, and in fact, particularly in Britain. And it's such an under-researched area. As I was mentioning this in my introductory remarks last week, that there's so little scholarship on 19th century women. And so really, I hope that this diversity reading list series can just make a few of these women a bit better known. And we're beginning with one who is one of my favorites, Frances Power Cobbe. We're going to be hearing about her today from Professor Sarah Scott from Manhattan College. And Sarah works in ethics and the history of philosophy with a focus on forgotten and neglected figures. She's written a lot about Martin Buber in particular, for instance, editing the book called Martin Buber, Creaturely Life and Social Form. She's currently working on a book on Frances Power Cobbe. It's going to be supported by a fellowship at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. And amongst other things, I'll just mention that she's also going to be speaking about Cobbe at the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics Summer School this year, because Cobbe had a lot to say inter alia about animal ethics. But anyway, today Sarah's just going to introduce us to Cobbe generally, I believe. So over to her.
Thank you so much, Alison. It's great to see you all here. And yeah, I do have to give a plug for Alison's works. So it was very generous of her to invite me to give the presentation on Cobbe when she could give a wonderful one herself. This is Alison's introduction to Cobbe here, and then we also have the anthology, The Essential Writings of Cobbe, that Alison edited. And many of the works that I'll reference today actually come from this anthology. So if you want to look at the primary sources in more detail, this would be a good resource. So when thinking about this presentation, let me start sharing my screen here, because I do have a PowerPoint here. When thinking about this presentation, let's see. Hold on, let me just get this set up. So, okay, how does that look to everybody? Yes, you can see it. Okay, good. So when thinking about this presentation, of course, I had to think, well, how do I not just repeat the good work that Alison has already done? So I'll be giving an overview, but some of what I'll be focusing on includes some research that I was able to do in the Cobbe archives at the Huntington Library in Pasadena this past summer. So I'll show you some letters and some texts that I got from the archive there. So Frances Power Cobbe. So as Alison mentioned, a forgotten 19th century woman philosopher. She was an interlocutor of John Stuart Mill and also Charles Darwin. And so one of the main contributions that researching her does is it changes the narrative that is sometimes told in moral philosophy, where there's a kind of simplistic divide between utilitarian and Kantian viewpoints. And it's understood that the utilitarians are the ones that really have the handle on women's rights and animal welfare. And it's not really clear what somebody writing from a Kantian viewpoint would have to say on these matters. And Cobbe completely shakes up this understanding. She also develops new moral concepts. For instance, I'll introduce her idea of heteropathy. And because she is writing in a time in which women were not allowed to do professional philosophy, but also professional philosophy really was kind of being created as a discipline toward the end of her life. Her work challenges notions of philosophic genre. So we have to look at things like pamphlets and newspaper columns as forms of philosophic writing and see the ways in which philosophic methods play out in these different writing styles. So first I'll start off with a bit about her life. So she's born in 1822, dies in 1904. When I go to Oxford, I'm very excited because I'm going to combine the trip with a trip to Ireland, and I'm going to visit Cobbe's house. So this is a photo of Cobbe's house, Newbridge. It's an accessible estate that apparently you can visit and take tours of. And just looking at this photo, you can see that she was raised in a fairly privileged environment. So while women were not able to be to receive the same education or to go to university, she did have other privileges. Now she's largely a self-taught philosopher. She describes accessing libraries and she describes these kind of years that she spent reading books, teaching herself, and kind of organizing the thoughts in her mind. It's a bit peculiar that she gets forgotten because she was so prominent and well known within the 19th century. She authored several popular books, dozens of articles, and she had a very it reached 100,000 readers. This was a massive platform for a woman philosopher to have at this time period. Besides being a very prolific author and well known in all of the literary and intellectual circles of the time period, she was also politically active. So she was instrumental in the passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act. I'll talk about that in a bit later. And she was also quite active in the anti-vivisection movement. In particular, she started the group that turned into Cruelty Free International, which is still quite active today. And you may recognize the Leaping Bunny logo on products that you can still buy now. So one of the things that I saw when I went into the archive, just to reinforce the sense of how well known she was and what a popular author she was when I was looking at the original books in the archive. Of course, you see the frontispieces and stuff like that. And so here's copies from two different books, and it's showing you know, the advertisements from the publishers of all the different books of hers. In the second edition, that she's receiving. And I think it'll just become even more clear as we go on just how prominent and influential she was. I need to also mention her lifelong partner. So you see this photo of Mary Charlotte Lloyd. Cobbe never married. This was she referred to Mary as her wife in some letters, and so they were longtime companions. Okay, so I'm going to start off by introducing her seminal work in moral philosophy, and this is Essay on Intuitive Morals. And I'm citing from the first bit of it, and that's in the anthology here. So first of all, just take a look at the dates. This is 1855. This is very early for somebody to be writing about Kant in English. And one of the mysteries when studying Cobbe is, you know, what version of Kant is this, right? There, you'll see that it's not necessarily the ways that we currently understand Kant. And as scholars, it's a bit challenging to figure out, okay, she's closer to to the time period, right? So are the people closer to the source, the true Kant, or is us later that with access to more texts, or read, like, are we the accessing the true Kant or whatnot? So anyhow, part of what my struggles in this research is figuring out, like, okay, is she really a Kantian or not, and what does this mean, right? She thinks that she is. She's going to insist until the very end that what she is doing is Kantian moral philosophy. Okay, so you see here in the beginning that she says that her goal is to popularize the ideas of Kant, and that the main claim that she's making is that the end of creation is not happiness, but the virtue of rational souls. And although this is her first main work, which she publishes anonymously in 1855, she's going to hold true to it so that she'll reissue it over the course of her life, even as late as 1902. And she's going to attach an appendix in 1902 to it called Darwinism and Morals. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the point is that she starts off framing herself as a Kantian and holds on to that throughout the rest of her career. Okay, so as we take a look at this, just take a look at this kind of summary here. Now, notice as I read this, the ways in which in every sentence, she's going to be going against some main claim made by utilitarianism. So I think she might be one of the main people that kind of first starts this kind of narrative that we have, where it's Kantianism versus utilitarianism, right? Okay, she says, we want a system of morals which shall not entangle itself with sectarian creeds or imperil its stability with that of tottering churches, but which shall be indissolubly blended with a theology fulfilling all the demands of the religious sentiment. A theology forming a part and the one living part of all the theologies which ever have been or ever shall be. So we notice immediately the ways in which she's linking a theological claim with a moral claim. She has a theistic understanding of Kant. Okay, and then now we get into the kind of point-by-point critique of utilitarian points. We want a state which shall not degrade the law of the eternal right by announcing it as a mere contrivance for the production of human happiness, or by tracing our knowledge of it to the senses, or by cajoling us into obeying it as a matter of expediency. But, and then here's the Kantian response, but a system which shall ascribe to that law its own sublime office in the universe, which shall recognize in man the faculties by which he obtains a supersensible knowledge of it, and which shall inculcate obedience to it on motives so pure and holy that the mere statement of them shall awaken in every breast that higher and better self, which can never be aroused by the call of interest or expediency. And of course, it's from Kant that she thinks you would get this systematic approach here. All right, so when I was in the archive, of course, I found letters from Mill and Helen Taylor there. And so here you see Mill and Taylor together. This is a letter from Mill. So they were, they had a very warm and respectful relationship. So he sent her an advanced copy of this subjection of women for her comments. Even though they disagreed on matters of moral theory, they respected one another greatly as people. And so here we have a letter in which he is asking her to write something for him and to send it to the Putnam. So again, just an indication of the way in which Mill respects her and is also supporting her, putting her in touch with publishers, getting her published and so forth. I found an interesting letter in which somebody is writing to Cobbe saying, are you not the original author of this unanswered argument against Mill? And so again, when you're doing this retrieval work for women in the history of philosophy, it's fascinating to go back in time and hear somebody saying, like, even in her own time period, she's making an argument, she's then getting erased, and then somebody's jumping in and saying, but wait a minute, weren't you the one that said this? The celebrated unanswered argument against Mill is a theological one, that the utilitarian approach to ethics could potentially lead people to do something that would be against some kind of theological duty. And so again, one of the surprises for me from a 21st century point of view was to realize just how deeply religious the debate was. That nowadays, if we think of, Kantian versus utilitarian moral debates or something like that, theology doesn't really play much of a part. But in the time period, it was a deep religious debate that was happening, not just a moral debate. And as well, it was an intense epistemological debate, right, where they're really debating the origin of ideas. Okay, and then the other letter that you see here, this is from Helen Taylor, and she's replying to a letter from Cobbe, in which Cobbe had asked her to run for parliament. And Helen Taylor is replying back and saying that she doesn't think it's the right time, that she thinks it'll actually hurt the cause if she runs for parliament. And so that was interesting to, again, just see the kind of internal debates within the women's movement there. Okay, so you see the ways in which she's positioning herself up as offering an alternative to the kind of dominant utilitarian thought of the day, driven by Mill and his circle. And she's proposing that Kant offers this alternative, but again, her Kant is different from our Kant. So when I tried to make sense of, okay, like, what is her Kant? These are the works by Kant that she cites in a theory of intuitive morals. She's a very syncretic thinker. So in this work where she's claiming to be popularizing Kant, she also references all of these other figures. And she's very serious when she says that Kant, in her understanding, Kant has latched on to the true moral but also theological understanding, and that whatever is true in any of these philosophers or systems is also going to be found in Kant as well. And so this is the kind of kernel of truth that she's seeing in all of these approaches. So again, a very syncretic thinker, a theistic approach. There's numerous letters in the archive between her and James Martineau. So I had to also think, when she calls her philosophy intuitive morals, like, what does she mean by intuitive morals? And some of that may have been influenced by James Martineau, who was a main interlocutor of hers. There's dozens and dozens of letters between them, spanning several decades. Less backed by textual evidence, but an idea that I'm playing with, so maybe you guys can tell me if it's a good idea or not, is I'm entertaining the idea that there may have been some overlap between her ideas and that of Lowell. And here I'm thinking of, again, like, who would have been the main debate partner with Mill here? And Lowell was one of the main debate partners when they were devising their different accounts of where ideas get generated. And there's some, although I don't have the textual evidence, I'm thinking that maybe there's a kind of intellectual overlap between Lowell and Cobbe in some interesting ways. So in particular, we need to think, how does somebody who frames themselves as being a Kantian moral philosopher respond to social change and the need to create new moral concepts? So this is something that the utilitarians are very good on, right? So they can, because they're learning from experience and they're constantly adjusting, they can come up with new concepts, and they can be constantly revising things. They can be a progressive philosophy. It's not obvious at the outset how you have progressive intuitionism. But this is something that Cobbe insists that we have, and it's something that gets played out in the totality of her work, where she's not just doing abstract moral theory, but she's trying to shift social and political thought. So, for instance, create a new understanding in society of women as being an end in themselves, or create a new understanding in society of the moral harm of domestic violence or animal experimentation. So here, Whewell actually helps us because he is an intuitionist, but he's a progressive intuitionist. And of course, he's the one who gives us these two main ideas of colligation and consilience. So here's a nice, and again, you'll see the epistemological debate with Mill here. Whewell and Mill were debating how deduction and induction actually operate. Okay, so here's Whewell's account of colligation. So he's critiquing Mill on induction here. He says, if we consider the facts of external nature to lie before us like a heap of pearls of various forms and sizes, mere observation, this is what he thinks Mill is doing, mere observation takes up an indiscriminate handful of these. Induction, as Whewell thinks is properly understood, seizes some thread on which a portion of the heap are strung and binds such threads together. And then in other works, he explains, okay, what is this thread that's going to allow us to recognize this and to have induction? He says the ideas, the germ of them at least, were in the human mind before experience, but by the progress of scientific thought, they are unfolded into clearness and distinctness. And this line of the ideas getting unfolded into clearness and distinctness, this will be repeated over and over by Cobbe when she is describing how intuition progresses. So again, I don't know if this is what Kant would have thought is happening, but this is kind of Cobbe's interpretation of what is happening. So again, I'm thinking that maybe if she wasn't directly reading Whewell, she was a part of the same kind of movement of thinking of intuition in this way. And then with consilience, we have this idea of separate lines of induction leading to the same law. And I think there's one of the things you'll see in Cobbe is that she's going to amass a lot of evidence about the harm of domestic violence. And this is all going to kind of lead up to the same, so through consilience, it's going to lead up to this one claim. But she's also going to amass a lot of evidence about the harm of animal experimentation. And this is going to lead up to, again, a similar law. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the creation of moral concepts that she's doing. So this is a text called The Final Cause of Women. It's from 1869. And a lot of Cobbe's ideas will seem familiar to us in the 21st century, but what's fascinating is how early she was as a thinker proposing them. So here we have the claim basically that women are an end in themselves. And what she starts off critiquing Kant and his claim that women have a merely instrumental end or a purpose. And of course, Kant thinks that he's flattering women. He calls women the priestesses of humanity. But in Combe's analysis, this is still not treating women as having this final cause. And so she coins an interesting set of terms to characterize this. She says, what people like Comte are doing is treating women as if they are an adjective, in which women are understood through the lens of what service they can provide to others or what kind of means to an end they can provide. So maybe they have some reproductive value or domestic value as a wife or a mother. You could even be praising them as, artists or philanthropists, and they have some important social role to play. But even if this is a positive role, it's still really just thinking of women as a so-called adjective. Again, thinking of she is in the 1860s, one of the first people to really use Kant for feminist purposes here. She says, woman was created for some end proper to herself. Let's call this woman as a noun. And we can then think of woman having an end to herself through two different paths. Perhaps there's what she calls the selfish path, in which her own happiness is her end, or what Cobbe is going to advocate, and she thinks this comes from Kant as well, the divine theory of woman's life, in which her virtue and religion are her end. And you'll see this kind of pattern of this kind of Kantian pattern of thinking that gets reinforced in her writing, right? Where she's saying, for example, no woman can be truly domestic who is only domestic, because this defeats its own end. Right? All right. So one of the joys in studying Kant is, or in studying Cobbe, no, definitely not in studying Kant. One of the joys in studying Cobbe is that she's such an excellent writer. And she employs lots of different techniques. And so, for example, she's constantly kind of inventing new terms, like let's call this an adjective, woman as adjective or woman as noun. She's fond of a syllogism. Here's an interesting piece. Criminals, idiots, women, and minors is the classification sound, a discussion on the laws concerning the property of married women. So here's an example of a popular piece of writing in which she's using, although she's not going to necessarily cite Kant or cite philosophic theories, she's going to incorporate them into the text, and she's going to use philosophic methods, but in such a way that's accessible for a popular audience, in order to advance these new moral theories spreading through society. So the main technique that she uses in this piece is to adopt the point of view of an impartial spectator. And the way that it's framed in the text is she imagines an extraterrestrial visitor looking down on Earth, who, because they're extraterrestrial, has this impartial viewpoint. And then she writes this kind of humorous exchange with this impartial spectator analyzing a wedding ceremony. And so she's so kind of to see what she's doing here. So the philosophic technique of impartial spectator, but wetting it with humor to write for this popular audience. So here's this impartial spectator. Pardon me, I must seem to you so stupid. Why is the property of the woman who commits murder and the property of the woman who commits matrimony dealt with alike by your law? Right, so this absurdity of this classification here, right, criminals, idiots, women, and minors, right, that all of these different sectors of humanity are being lumped together under the law in the same way. Here's another interesting text of hers, again, thinking, how does she kind of bring her philosophic ideas to a popular audience? And take a look at the date here. This is a text called The Duties of Women. This is the piece that I pointed out to you, was in its 9th edition and had already had Italian editions and American editions and so forth. I found a letter in the archive from somebody in Japan saying that they thought it should be published in Japan and translated there as well, although I don't know that anything ever came of that. Okay, and notice that it's also towards the end of her life. So you see the ways in which she's focused on women's rights for the entirety of her life, and for the entirety of her life, she keeps grounding it back in Kant. So here we have 1881. So The Duties of Women it was a book that was based on a series of public lectures that she gave. This is a different type of popular writing, because this is a woman writing for women. And I think this is an interesting genre to explore in the 19th century, because besides the publication of these lectures that women would give for other women, we also have conduct books, right? And so it's interesting to kind of think about how philosophy gets done in circles of people that are banned from academia. So you have, and that may not have been well studied, because it's just not on most people's radar to think of a kind of closed community here of women writing for women, and what kind of philosophy are they doing in this closed community, and how do the philosophic theories or writing or methods change perhaps when they're in this different community setting. Okay, so Cobbe starts off with this kind of popular book saying, if you want to know more, read Kant, but I'm going to give you again this kind of popular account. And one of the things to note about how she interprets Kant is the way that she's using virtue here. So as a Kantian, she's focused on our moral duty, of course, and she describes virtue as the free choice of duty. And she mentions these virtues as being the kind of cardinal virtues. They're not the typical list, right? So she says chastity, temperance, veracity, courage, and the vindication of rightful liberty. So you have a moral obligation to see yourself as an end and to work for your own liberation, right? To support your own autonomy or liberty here. In the duties of women, she goes through several different spheres of influence. So the duty to yourself, the duty to your family, to your immediate community, to broader society. She describes a personal duty to yourself as setting the divine kingdom up internally. And then when, to use later language, the moral circle, so to speak, gets expanded, this social duty is going to extend this divine kingdom throughout society. So there's a kind of hierarchy, this a moral extension of duties as an extension of beneficence. But you have this a strict moral duty to always work for the vindication of your rightful liberty, right? So for example, she'll say that obedience within marriage is a kind of moral suicide here. So again, this is something that later 20th and 21st century feminists influenced by Kant might say similar things. But again, it's fascinating that here she is in 1881 saying it, and that the book was so widely read and went through so many editions. So here is a letter from Mary Livermore. She was an important American women's rights thinker. And here she is saying that the duties of women is just what women need at the present moment. And she is proposing that it be made the textbook for ethics classes in women's colleges in the United States, which is just, fascinating. Also in the archive, of course, I found some of Cobbe's other works where she's you see the political side of things. And again, I'm holding these really fragile texts in my hand. Sometimes the librarians would run over actually and make me put something down and rest it on a velvet cushion, and they would bring out the gloves. I was so afraid they were going to disintegrate the whole time. So here's this pamphlet, Why Women Desire the Franchise, in which Cobbe is going to lay out all these different arguments here. And of course, I'm thinking, well, what did this mean for, the woman on the street corner? And maybe another woman approaches her and says, here, take this pamphlet, right? And what that would have, the significance of that moment and the circulation of these ideas, and just what it meant to be a philosopher during the time period, making these kinds of arguments. Okay, so this is, and now I need to warn you to mentally prepare yourself that I'll start talking about domestic violence and also animal experimentation. And sometimes there will be some graphic descriptions on the screen, so you may wish to avert your eyes at some points. Besides things like the property of married women and women's suffrage, one of the main social and political causes that Cobbe was working for was to address domestic violence. And so here is an important article she wrote called Wife Torture in England. what she's doing is she is taking a concept that people have, torture. And again, think about this progressive intuitionism. She's evolving this idea of torture, so it becomes more clear and distinct, she would probably say. And we realize that actually domestic violence is a kind of torture. It's wife torture. And she attaches to this article in which she develops this moral concept, a draft bill of the 1878 Matrimonial Causes Act. And so this act allowed women to divorce. It gave custody of the children to the wife and a court order for spousal and child support. So obviously extremely important. And also in this piece, you see when she's saying, okay, why am I calling this English wife torture? Again, because she wants to impress upon us the ways in which the earlier terms didn't really adequately capture the reality of the event. So for example, the term wife beating doesn't actually capture what's happening. We need to use the concept torture instead. And you see also in this quote here that she says this kind of slippery use of language, this is also used by the vivisectors. This was interesting because you see her starting to kind of marry in her mind in 1878 the ways in which people are not fully recognizing what's happening to women with the ways in which they're not recognizing what's happening to non-human animals. So this inability to recognize moral harm and what's happening. Of course, nowadays we might call this something like testimonial or hermeneutical injustice. And so in this piece, although she obviously doesn't use these terms, she refers to some ideas that I think support them in interesting ways. So she mentions things like Punch and Judy. Why was this the national street drama for more than 2 centuries? Why was it a common assumption that it was worse to assault a strange woman than one's own wife, right? So through this kind of cultural practices and common assumptions, there's a lack of understanding of hermeneutical injustice, but also there's a problem with testimony, which we will see come out, and we'll see the ways in which she tries to address this issue of testimony. This question of hermeneutical and testimonial injustice, I think, relates in some interesting ways to another moral concept that she has, which is heteropathy. And I'll go through that in more detail in just a minute. But here we see a quote from her. She says, and so this quote is describing the phenomena of heteropathy. The more the tyrant causes the victim to suffer, the more he hates him and desires to heap on him fresh sufferings. The group of his shivering and starving children and weeping wife is the sad sight, which, greeting the eyes of the husband and father reeling home from the gin shop, somehow kindles his fury. Here's a sight in which we would expect sympathy to be activated, but with her theory of moral emotions, we'll see that she says actually the opposite gets activated. She says, if the baby cry in the cradle, he taps on it. If his wife wring her hands in despair, he fells her to the ground. And I'm not going to read this. This is where you can take it upon yourself if you want to read it for yourself or avert your eyes. When thinking about, so there's so many different techniques that she could have used to make this moral concept more clear and distinct for this popular audience. For example, it's the 19th century. She could have gone to a sentimental approach, right? She could have had sentimentalist accounts of victims or survivors that were describing things. I suspect she thinks that this will backfire because of her theory of sympathy. The audience is not going to be receptive to the testimony of a victim, because if they hear an account of suffering or vulnerability, they will tend to, in her analysis, have some aversion towards the victim, and conversely identify and have some sympathy with the perpetrator. This is like the huge kind of moral problem, like how do we solve this then? So instead of using a sympathetic approach, she's going to use the complete opposite approach. This is going to be somewhat similar to her impartial spectator, but not humorous, right? So she's going to use a kind of journalistic style of writing. Of course, this fits because she's working as a journalist, writing for the Echo and so forth. And so and you also see the ways of this colligation and consilience, right? So she's going to collect this massive amounts of data, all presented in this kind of very objective, neutral fashion. So she's just listing all of the different instances. And all of the emotions and pathos are pulled out of it. And I think her claim is actually, this is what is going to get us. If we put sympathy in, we will turn off. And she includes some kind of journalistic drama here. So for example, you hear in this essay, she says, here is one that has come in while I have been writing. Because of course the audience is supposed to picture her in the Echo newsroom where they're getting, stuff over the wire from the police offices, right? Okay, so let's take a closer look at this theory of moral emotions that she has. And I mentioned that she had a respectful, warm relationship with Mill. She also had a respectful, warm relationship with Darwin. And so if Mill is her main kind of debate partner early in her career, Darwin is her debate partner later on in her career. It's a fruitful relationship. They agree on some matters, but disagree on other matters. In particular, so you'll see this piece, Heteropathy, Aversion, and Sympathy. I believe this is also in the anthology if you want a closer look. Notice the title under which it gets reprinted. So it gets reprinted as the evolution of the social sentiment. So this is like her answer to Darwin, right? And she's saying, okay, the way that evolution works is that it's not going to necessarily cause us to be more and more sympathetic, as maybe Darwin kind of rosily imagined, or even the utilitarians when they're imagining that we, through experience and so forth, have this expanded moral circle and whatnot. She's thinking this isn't actually how evolution and experience works. It doesn't happen naturally. It has to happen through a kind of Kantian understanding of moral duty and using reason to pain with pain, but instead heteropathic resentment against pain. So when we see the sight of pain, the emotion that we naturally feel is more akin to something like anger and irritation than to tenderness and pity. When we see the sight of somebody in a state of pleasure, we're naturally, selfish, jealous, more akin to displeasure than to reflected enjoyment. Okay, so she says heteropathy is the sudden and possibly transient emotion here of just a kind of immediate anger or irritation at the sight of suffering, but this can harden into antipathy. And this might be if she had developed it further, a kind of foundation for a theory of prejudice against women and other figures, right? Antipathy implying permanent dislike with a certain combination of disgust. Okay, now remember, she's going to remain in her eyes a Kantian until the end. So she says these instincts, heteropathy, sympathy, and so forth, these are not the moral sense itself, right? This is just what the moral sense works upon. So we derive a solemn sense of duty, and duty tells us that we need to cultivate sympathy rather than heteropathy. Duty tells us that we need to expand this moral circle across all of these lines. But of course, many people aren't following this moral duty here, and they're just having a kind of naturalistic moral sense. Here's a wonderful quote here. She says, again, think about the time period and the hunting sports of the time period. She says, the most tender-hearted of fox hunters and fowlers tell us that they sympathize so much with the hounds that they have no time to feel for the fox. Okay, so now let's think about this from a 20th and 21st century point of view. We think about things like the Me Too movement and this phenomena that we see in our contemporary society. Kate Mann will call it empathy, where we have a very hard time sympathizing with victims and survivors. And for whatever reason, we seem to be immediately drawn to sympathize with the perpetrator, right? And here we have Cobbe giving a theory of why this is the case, right? They sympathize so much with the hounds, they have no time to feel for the fox. Okay, so this idea of moral sentiment and the evolution of this sentiment under the guidance of a kind of Kantian sense of moral duty. As I mentioned, this plays out in Cobbe's life through these conversations she has with Darwin. So here's letters in the archive. On the left, you see a letter from Darwin thanking her for sending him Kant. I don't know that it had much of an influence on him, but she at least tried. And there's on the right, you see a letter where he's praising her for her account of animal consciousness. Here's an area in which they actually had agreement. And in fact, there's some very cute exchanges from them in the letters where they're talking about their memories of their dogs and how this proves that dogs actually have feelings and so forth as they're relaying the accounts of their dogs' stories. Let me back. So you'll notice the handwriting. So this is Darwin. And here's another letter by Emma Darwin. So it's the same handwriting. And so as I'm going through the letters, I was realizing the extent to which Emma was really working as Charles's secretary here. And it makes it rather difficult to interpret the letters because the speaker is going to shift sometimes. So sometimes it's signed Darwin, but Emma inserts comments, or vice versa. Sometimes it's like she's writing for the two of them. Here's a piece in which it looks like she's writing initially for the two of them. So many thanks for taking the trouble to write on these matters. We wanted to see your article, et cetera, et cetera. You see on the very end of the letter, she's going to break out of her role as Darwin's secretary. Again, for thinking about women in the history of philosophy, this is interesting to see Emma kind of breaking out and saying, well, here's my ideas, as she's speaking directly to Cobbe. And of course, we don't know, did Charles read what Emma wrote, or did he just trust her to write? And then she just writes this other page at the end, right, straight to Cobbe. So here Emma says, speaking in my private capacity, I agree with you. And again, it's a theological debate that they're having. She says, I don't know whether his views, she's referring to Charles here, I don't know whether his views on the moral sense would exclude spiritual influence, although they're not included in his theory. But Emma, speaking in her private capacity, agrees with Cobbe here that this sense of moral duty has to fit within a theistic framework here. So Emma signs the letter saying, so you see, I am a traitor in the camp, right? She's on Cobbe's side here, actually. Okay, so let's turn to some of the work that Cobbe did as a part of the anti-vivisection movement. And so again, in a kind of simplistic narrative, we might think that it's the utilitarians that are focused on animal welfare. What does the Kantian have to say about this? And she's never going to deviate from the basic Kantian claims, but she will say that merely sentient beings have their own ends. It's just that rather than this being virtue, as it is for rational and moral beings, their end is happiness. And as we have a duty to promote the virtue of rational and moral beings, we also have a duty to promote the happiness of merely sentient beings. She says the duty, if the creature could feel so that's a typo, it should say the creature could feel pain, to avoid inflicting it, if it could feel pleasure, to bestow it. Again, this is a kind of Kantian, or sorry, utilitarian idea here, right? We want to increase pleasure, minimize pain, but then she twists this with a Kantian way. She says, this is a necessary moral law. We cannot even conceive the contrary, nor figure to our imaginations a world or a condition of things wherein the obligation can be suspended or reversed. And often you will hear people say that a Kantian view would support animal welfare only insofar as it would have a beneficial effect on the virtue of rational and moral beings, but not for the sake of the animals themselves. And she argues against this. She says each duty must be done for its own sake. No duty can be fulfilled truly save disinterestedly. Right? She's thinking, okay, just what is the basic definition of the duty here? She says the attempt to produce our own moral culture out of our humanity and beneficence is, by the hypothesis, absurd. We are bound to consider the welfare of the brutes for their sake, not ours. And because they have this end, it's just that their end is different from our end. Right? Okay, so a utilitarian is still going to critique her because she still does have this kind of Kantian distinction between the rational beings and the merely sentient. So she says, for example, the interests of the merely sentient can only be regarded after those of the moral being have been fulfilled. However, she thinks in practice that this is never going to allow for things like animal experimentation. So while theoretically you might say animal experimentation could be justified if the life was really demanded by science and there was no pain and so forth, in practice, this is never going to be justified. And in that sense, perhaps she would be even more extreme than a utilitarian critique of use of animals. This photo that you see here, this is a picture of her dog. So again, thinking about all the different writing techniques that she used to try to advance her moral ideas. This is a book that she wrote called Confessions of a Lost Dog, in which she thinks from the point of view of a dog that has been lost. So this is interesting because here is her dabbling in a sentimental approach. Right? She's dabbling, okay, let us identify with the victim, so to speak. But just as she did with advancing concepts regarding women, she's going to kind of try to be more neutral when it comes to advancing ideas about animals, but it's going to backfire, as we'll see. Okay, so she actually withdraws from her position as a paid professional writer when it comes to pass that the different publications don't take a public stand against vivisection. So she resigns in protest. And this means that she's lost this massive audience that she has, and she starts to do more and more pamphlet production. And so here's an example of a pamphlet, Light in Dark Places. And so now, instead of collecting the police reports over the newswire and presenting these in this kind of dispassionate, objective way, what she's going to collect to build up the moral concept is she's going to collect accounts from the scientists and physicians themselves. Again, so that there can be no doubt that this is actually happening. So again, think about what's happening with this question of testimony and how do we combat heteropathy and testimonial injustice here. So she's not, and obviously the animals can't speak for themselves. So who is going to testify? It's going to be the perpetrators that are going to testify. Okay, so I'm not going to read this because it's perhaps too vivid. But she's quoting from somebody that was watching somebody performing a procedure on a dog. And she doesn't just use textual testimony, but she uses illustrations as testimony. And again, she pulls these illustrations from the actual medical and scientific textbooks themselves. So again, turning the perpetrators against themselves. She can't help herself with the kind of gallows humor here. Here is another machine invented by one of the leading members of the Leipzig Society for the Protection of Animals, right? The hypocrisy. And at the same time, the head of one of the largest physiological laboratories in the world, right? So we have these, and remember that these animals would not have been anesthetized. They may have been paralyzed, but they wouldn't have been anesthetized. Some of this was just completely wanton. So on the right-hand side, you see the illustration of a rabbit just being baked alive. And then again, a description from the textbook, what happens when the rabbit is baked or boiled. And then Cobbe jumps in, again, she's thinking like, first of all, she's building up an idea of this as actually being torture in the mind of the reader through this kind of dispassionate collection of the perpetrator's own testimony. But she's also kind of making the argument about this kind of evolution of the moral sense, right? And what happens in moral education. So here we have in parentheses, she's inserting her own commentary, right? So now we have Bernard describing the death of these dogs and pigeons and so forth. And then she inserts, these are lectures to students, right? This is how we're training our next medical doctors. Surely you would be training them in a different way than this. What are you doing to their moral sense if this is the education that they're receiving? And again, think about this phenomena of the sympathy being directed towards the perpetrators. And again, this flies in the face of everything we've been told in the 20th and 21st century about the debate between utilitarians and Kant and who was really on the side of animals and so forth. She says, our opponents, who are almost to a man utilitarians, if not agnostics, because remember, there's always this theological current, are by no means willing to settle the question on the grounds of simple deductive morals. For the large benefit to the human race, they will contend that almost anything is justifiable, including the torture of animals. And all of this sympathy is directed toward the perpetrators, not to the victims. They talk of their duty to vivisect in the sacred cause of humanity and bid us stand by and admire their deep sympathy with human suffering, which makes them sacrifice all their own tender sentiments of compassion to animals in the hopes of bringing some relief to the sickbed from the laboratory. So that we should feel sorry for the perpetrators that they have to do this terrible work, rather than directing our sympathy towards the animals, right? Okay, and just in closing, I'll point out two more things that I found in the archive. She had dozens and dozens of letters from people about this anti-vivisection debate. So in the book project, one of the things I'm going to do is go through all of these letters because it's a snapshot of what the debate was. He wrote his own pamphlet, Popular Fallacies About Vivisection. And in fact, here is a letter from, of course, he signs it Dodgson here, to Cobbe, and he had trouble getting this published. And this is interesting because it's an indication of just how prominent she was. Cobbe intervened and got Carroll's work published here. And here's a letter where he's thanking her for helping him have his anti-vivisection work published. This was fascinating because, again, I was thinking, okay, this question of sympathy towards the victim or towards the perpetrator and testimonial injustice, and how do you have progressive intuition and the creation of new moral concepts and so forth. I'm thinking, okay, what was the 19th century version of like the Me Too movement? And so here we have the British Vivisectors Directory, a black book for the United Kingdom. And Cobbe wrote the preface to this. And so what this directory is, a black book, it is a list of the names, affiliations, and all the evidence that they could collect for all the people that were doing animal experimentation in England. So here you see Ferrier. I believe he was the first person to be prosecuted under the Animal for Cruelty Act, although I think it was overturned. You see Thomas Huxley over here. The list goes on. It's going to be, if you go through it, you'll just, it's a who's who in the scientific and medical world. And again, the victims can't testify, so the testimony comes from their own writings, right? So here's from, Huxley's own textbooks where he's describing it. Or it's Ferrier and it's testimony from his own trial where he's explaining what he was doing. Now, also in the archive, there's exchanges with Wilkie Collins, the famous novelist, and she helped him write one of his novels, which has as the villain a vivisector. And there's an interesting debate between Cobbe and Collins, which kind of goes to this question of how do you advance moral concepts and what do you do with testimony and sympathy and so forth. And Collins says, because Collins is going to use the complete opposite writing style and method of persuasion, right, than what Cobbe is doing here. And, writing these kind of dramatic novels and whatnot. And Collins says, I'm going to write the villain in a sympathetic way. I'm going to play in to the readership and that the reader naturally wants to identify with the perpetrator. And Collins says, I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to describe in detail what the crimes actually are. And he says, I'm going to do this because that's the only way that I can get the reader to keep reading the book. If I tell them what is actually being done, they're going to stop reading. Cobbe didn't go down that path. Cobbe told people what was actually being done. And she calls out hundreds of the most prominent people in society. And Collins writes back to her and says, you don't understand what you're doing. Each one of these names has 1,000 students or patients or friends that deeply respect them as a person of moral character. And you publicizing this is going to trigger sympathy for the perpetrator, not for the victim. It's going to backfire. And in fact, Collins seems to have been right. Right, historically, that's what happened, right? Cobbe starts to get more and more criticism, and she starts to get more and more suppressed as a thinker until eventually she's erased from history, basically. Okay, so I'm definitely over time. Thank you for your patience here. I'll just end with some nice photos of the anti-vivisection movement, and you see just how women-led it is. So here they are in Trafalgar Square, and all of the women there with their signs. All right, thank you very much.